Okay, well, good morning or good afternoon or good evening or good night. Depends on where and when you're watching this, but thanks for joining us. I have a really interesting guest today. I'm really privileged to have with me Tom Standage, who is the author of a book called, well, he's author of a number of books, as well as being deputy editor of The Economist. He wrote A History of the World in 6 glasses. And 3 of those glasses were alcoholic. So that's why he's come to talk to me today. Tom, thanks a million for taking the time.
Great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So maybe start off the idea of the book. I mean, you've written a number of books, but this was the one that caught my eye. It was actually a previous guest I had on here, Tom Ross from Bastet Brewing in Florida, who recommended it to me. And
oh, right.
Where we went. So
it is my best-selling book. I mean, I think there's something kind of, and this was sort of what gave me the idea for it. There is something universal about drinking, right? And I quite often, all my books are history books, but when I imagine traveling back in time to various points in history, and I'm interested in lots of different parts of history. But some of the parts of history, if I went back to Victorian London, I'd be able to talk to people there. That'd be fine. And if I went back to the scientific revolution period of the 1660s, another of my favorite period, again, basically there's lots of Europeans I could talk to. But some of the periods of history that I'm interested in, like the late Roman Republic or the first cities of the Fertile Crescent, these are places where I would not look like a local, and I would also not speak any of the languages. And I sometimes imagine what would happen when I stepped out of my time machine. Assuming I wasn't instantly murdered, I would sort of end up sort of doing sign language with people, and eventually I hope someone would give me a beer. And that was sort of the beginning of it, because that was what everyone was drinking in those days, and that was the sort of universal sign of hospitality and friendship and so on. And so that was really kind of where I started from, that drinks and drinking various different things runs throughout history and is absolutely universal. And I think that also explains why this book has been by far my best-selling book. It's one of 2 New York Times bestsellers I've written, the other one being on food, again something very universal. But the idea was to sort of look at history through the bottom of a glass and say, what were the drinks that people were drinking at different points of history, and how did that particular drink interact with history? Because in many cases you can link what's going on in the world at the time, or in a particular part of the world, to a particular drink. And in some cases, the drink is the consequence of what's happening. So with agriculture, for example. But in some cases, the drink is actually driving what's happening. And there's this whole theory that people took up agriculture so they could drink beer. And similarly, there's other points in history. The scientific revolution occurs when coffee arrives in Europe. I don't think that's a coincidence. Everyone's been drinking beer and wine for thousands of years. The first caffeinated drink shows up, and suddenly they go, oh, science. So these are the kinds of stories that I'm telling, and I think this is a reason why people like reading these kinds of stories. It is serious history, but it's made very palatable by wrapping it up in the story of these various drinks.
Well, yeah, that was what occurred to me. I mean, I flew through the book. It's very, very readable, and I kind of hesitate to use it in a way. As you're reading it, it's almost like, I was going to say shallow, in that it's just like,
it's very broad. It's not terribly deep. I mean, it is touching on various things. But yeah, I mean, the other thing is I wrote it sort of to be read. My audience for it is sort of my 14-year-old self. So I'm kind of assuming that you're curious about the world, but I'm assuming you don't necessarily know that much. And so having the kind of larger themes and the main points in basically, Western world history spelt out for you, but in this way that is, you're led through it by the drinks. One of the reasons this book did well was that it was re-promoted on an American TV show before Father's Day, the year after it came out. And a lot of people kind of bought this book because they're like, well, what does my dad like? I know he likes beer, or I know he likes whiskey, so I'm going to get him this book. And so I think that was what put it on the New York Times bestseller list the first time. But the other thing about it, the reason it continues to sell, is that it's been on the AP World History curriculum in the US for many years. And this is the extra credit high school history course. And it's basically a way of getting teenagers to read about history. And I can't tell you the number of times I've had messages from teenagers who say, "I'm being forced to read your book. I hate you, Mr. Standage." And then I get another message like a week later saying, "Actually, it was quite good. Sorry. And by the way, can you answer a couple of questions because I've got to write an essay?" But it's very amusing that people sort of they resent being forced to read, a serious non-fiction book, and then they discover it's actually not that serious. And yes, fine, you'll learn about these various key points in history, but it's as if I've spiked your drink, right? You think you're drinking a beer, and actually I'm getting some history in there without you noticing. So it makes it go down much more easily, I think.
Yeah, well, I'd say, I mean, it's not even just history; it's sociology. It's everything really. Like it tells you how that
I'm
influence.
really, I'm really a technology writer, and what I'm doing is I'm treating the drinks as technologies.
Right.
And most of my books are about how a technology spread. So my first book was called The Victorian Internet, and it was about how the Victorians had the telegraph system, and a lot of the things that happen on the internet and happened in the internet when it first showed up in the 1990s happened on the telegraph networks of the 19th century. And so the point is that human nature is the same, and you shouldn't blame technologies for the ways humans misuse them. And there are these are sort of recurring themes in my book. The thing about the drinks book was I was treating the drinks as technologies as well. So many of them are medicinal. So beer is used medicinally from absolutely the earliest times, and other drinks are used as currencies, or they're used as stimulants so that you can regulate your sleep or stay alert in a factory, or if you've got a switch from working in fields to working in offices and factories, then waking up and getting to work on time is important, so caffeine becomes more important, etc., etc. So they all have these different sort of functions that they have, and so I'm really sort of treating the drinks kind of like technologies and seeing it through that prism.
Yeah, well, that was one of the things that I just remember. There is a big emphasis on it is using it, and you say this in one of your phrases. I've got it down here. There, yeah, that there was that wine was, it, and the beer and that, but you specifically mentioned wine being kind of a portable water purification technology.
Yeah, that's another thing that all of these drinks are doing, which is that they're all safer to drink than water. And so if you haven't got reliable access to fresh water, which a lot of people have not had in the past, and a lot of people still don't have today, then the great thing about, well, I mean, the process of beer, you're essentially boiling the water, or at least you're heating it up quite a lot, because you get different basically enzymes activated at different temperatures when you're when you're making the mash and you're making the wort and you're heating it up. And this was done in the old days by heating up stones on a campfire and lobbing them into whatever you were making the beer in, which would have probably been animal intestines initially. So you can make beer without pottery. You can't make wine without pottery.
Yeah.
So beer is older. But yes, those sorts of things. So beer would have been safer to drink than water in early cities in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. And in fact, everyone is drinking beer. Children are sent to school with beer because it's safer than water when you've got a lot of people living close together. And similarly, wine is antibacterial for a different reason. It's the tannins in wine that can be antibacterial, and then you get the same. I mean, spirits are used as a medicine, and sort of still are, and then coffee and tea, you're boiling water again, so you get this very, very clear drop in infant mortality in European cities. You see this particularly in England when tea is introduced in the 18th century, and this is just when people are being basically crammed together in industrializing cities in places like Manchester, and the infant mortality rate suddenly drops, and it's because people are drinking tea and they're boiling water to make tea. And so there are all of these surprising ways in which it's a health drink. Coca-Cola was originally a health drink. Hard to imagine, but it was. And it was originally a health drink made of, its ancestor was a health drink made of red wine mixed with cocaine, which is obviously nothing to do with what Coca-Cola is now, but it was called French wine Coca, and that was what the creator of Coca-Cola was making first. But then he had to come up with a non-alcoholic version of it because of prohibition in the particular part of the US he was in before nationwide prohibition came in the 20th century. And so he switched to making this basically Coca and cola infused flavoring, and that's where Coca-Cola comes from. So again, it has health connotations. Similarly, in the when coffee is introduced in the 17th century, one of its proponents is William Harvey, the discoverer of the circulation of the blood, and he and other medical men think that coffee has all sorts of wonderful therapeutic properties, and so they recommend it. And so you get this time and time again. They're all medicines.
Yeah, but no, it was just that particular, like I said, that is a constant theme as it comes through your book. But that particular phrase that you mentioned about the a portable
Yes,
water
exactly, exactly.
purification for the Romans. Because I know there's a lot of people who kind of they argue with that idea of it being, that people drank beer because water was bad. Now,
Well, it's
not
yeah, it's not quite as simple as all the water was bad, and people did know how to find clean water, and they did know that certain. I mean, they didn't understand, they didn't have germ theory and so on. But I mean, the idea that all the water was bad and that people in the past were stupid and couldn't figure out whether water was clean or not. I think it's more that in a crowded city, it's going to be difficult to find
yeah,
fresh water that's safe to drink, and so buying beer from your local, making your own beer at home. That would be a safer way of having something to drink than drinking water, which might be contaminated. And so you can see that. But yes, people are drinking water alongside this when they are confident that it's safe to drink.
yeah, that's the thing. So just on the book, I mean, like I said, you've got the 6 beers. Where did you, or not 6 beers, six
Six
drinks?
drinks, yeah.
Did you start off with those 6 in mind, or did it
Yeah,
develop
so
and then you had to
so I
think about
started off. I thought I'd do a history of the world through wine, but it turns out that a history of wine is much less interesting than some of the other drinks. I mean, it's quite fun. There's some quite good episodes in it, but wine is sort of interesting as a status symbol, and in particular, it's defined in opposition to beer.
Yeah,
And beer is sort of less sophisticated, and wine shows that you're. I mean, wine was always the drink for the wealthier people, and you get this in Mesopotamia, you get this in Egypt, that the wealthy people drink wine and they drink beer as well, but it's a celebratory drink, whereas everyone drinks beer. So there's that aspect of it, and then some of the other drinks like coffee. I loved the coffee house internet idea, which was one of my framings for this, which is that the coffee houses of London in the 1660s were very much like websites. They specialized in particular subjects, and
yeah,
you would go and get the news on those particular subjects. And so there's that whole story. Then you've got tea in the British Empire and sort of tea and imperialism and the way that they're connected. I mean, the most obvious connection is the Boston Tea Party and the way that the break with America. I mean, it's actually there's lots of other factors. Sugar is a big part of it as well. But funnily enough, but that's an example of how a drink is. Everyone's heard of the Boston Tea Party, and that's an example of how a drink plays a world historical role. So there were all of these sort of different drinks in different parts of history. The key insight, what I couldn't figure out was I knew I wanted to do beer and wine in the ancient world, and I wanted to do coffee and tea and Coca-Cola as the avatar of the rise of America and globalization and sort of the rise of marketing and modern capitalism. That was all pretty obvious. The bit I couldn't figure out was how to get from the ancient drinks to the sort of colonial period.
the spirits.
And exactly. So the breakthrough was when I realized that instead of trying to do an individual drink, I ought to do spirits as a category. And that enabled me to do basically brandy and whiskey and rum. And it's actually brandy and rum. It's rum that's sort of most significant. I added a paragraph or two to the British edition of the book on gin, because gin is, the whole gin craze that happens in London in the 18th century is quite interesting, but Americans generally haven't heard of that. But no, I mean, it was the ability to put all the spirits together, because again, they have a common technology underneath, which is that you're taking beer and fermenting it to make whiskey, or you're taking wine, sorry, not fermenting it, distilling it, and you're taking wine and distilling it to make brandy, and then you're taking various things and distilling them to make things like rum or vodka or other spirits. And so that gave me the link. And of course, spirits have this role in history, that they're used as one of the currencies in the slave trade. And this is because people in West Africa did not have the technology of distillation. So the strongest drinks they could make were things like palm wines that top out at about 14-15% alcohol. And so being able to have this much stronger drink was extremely attractive. And that was one of the currencies that was used by slave traders coming from Europe. And then, it ends up that the molasses and the slave plantations in the West Indies, those are then used to make rum, which is then sent back across the Atlantic, to buy more slaves. And so it all goes around in the so-called triangular trades. So that's a period of history, and that kind of gets me from essentially the early medieval period through to the scientific revolution, and is an important story that has to be told. And the nice thing about framing with spirits is that I can include brandy and the medicinal use of brandy and the technology of distillation and how that arose, and then I can move on to things like rum, and that sort of starts to open up and globalize the picture.
Right. Yeah. No. It won't make sense. It is a I mean, obviously there's overlap, but it is a very linear
Yeah.
sort of time frame. And like I said, it's really dramatic in that cutoff between, the first three are alcoholic over that period of, like, from the start of civilization all the way up to kind of 18th century maybe, and then it suddenly
Yeah.
becomes non-alcoholic the rest of the way. And like I said, that
Well, three with alcohol, three with caffeine, exactly. And I
yeah,
haven't done. I mean, I don't know if you've had beers with caffeine in them, but
no,
yeah,
I
they
don't.
they exactly they do exist. And caffeinol is where you mix caffeine and alcohol. I think it's sometimes used as a treatment for strokes, because it does things to the blood flow in the brain. So there's some evidence that caffeinol can have medicinal value, which is what you'd expect, right? Because people have been saying that caffeine and alcohol individually have had medicinal value for thousands of years.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, it's then, like you said, what you said again. I have it down here somewhere that, with coffee, Western Europe began to emerge from an alcoholic haze that had lasted for centuries.
Yeah, well, the Great Soberer, it was called at the time. Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely. And so they were seen very much as opposites. And people, they said, even in the 17th century, people are talking about this idea that caffeine is sort of the opposite of alcohol, and that if you've had a bit too much to drink, then it sobers you up, and
yeah,
this sort of thing.
that's
So
right.
that's a very, very old idea.
Yeah, so but like you did link that, as you said earlier there, with, the rise of kind of science in Western Europe, and that's the thing.
Yeah.
And what occurred to me, because I hadn't realized that in Islam, I mean, we all associate that with, it is a sober, teetotal society, but that there was a debate about that at the start.
Yes, there was. So coffee was also known as the wine of Islam, in the early 17th century, because yes, Muslims generally don't drink alcohol, not exclusively, but and so their equivalent of the pub was the coffee house. And so the coffee house is not just coffee that comes into Europe; it's the institution of the coffee house, which is a meeting place where people go and play games and discuss the news and this sort of thing. And so coffee houses became. I mean, there were concerns that coffee houses were sort of hotbeds of dissent in the Arab world, and that's certainly how they were seen in Europe. And so there were various attempts to suppress coffee houses because they were sort of politically dangerous. But yes, one of the great things about coffee houses, and one of the sort of rules that's brought in with coffee houses, is that anyone can talk to anyone else. And so the idea, not necessarily observed all the time, but the ideal, was that class distinctions were sort of left behind at the door, and actually you were engaging in an intellectual discussion. And so this allowed people to meet people they might otherwise not have met, and so you get, unsurprisingly, I think, an enormous amount of innovation coming out of coffee houses, because essentially you've got more intermixing of people and of ideas. And so you get things like, you get commercial innovation. So the first the London stock market is descended from a coffee house in London called Jonathan's. You get scientific innovation because people are often actually doing scientific lectures and experiments in coffee houses and discussing them. And you can overhear someone talking, and you can go and say, "Oh, what about this? What about that?" Samuel Pepys's diary gives you a very clear picture of this as well. He's always meeting people in coffee houses, very often sort of people who've been around the world. So he'll meet ships captains in coffee houses, and they'll say, "Oh yes, when I was in this part of the world, I saw this." And he loves hearing these
Right.
stories from other parts of the world. So you get this sort of terrific mixing of in all sorts of ways that leads to innovation of various kinds. And I think that's one of the great things that coffee houses have given us.
Yeah, I hadn't realized any of that before I read the book. I just assumed the coffee houses, they go in, they had coffee,
But
and
we should be talking about beer. We're not, we haven't
we
talked
should
about,
actually.
there's not
Yes,
enough beer going on here. So let's
yeah,
go back. We should go probably right back to the beginning, and with the point that this is one of my favorite bits of the book. Is the beer theory of civilization. So the idea being, and this is a reasonably respectable archaeological theory, that the reason that people took up agriculture was they wanted to make sure they would have enough beer. And it is slightly mysterious why people switched from being hunter gatherers to agriculturalists, so being settled in one place and farming, because farming is much harder work. You have to work a lot more of the time making
yeah,
sure that your fields are doing what they should, and your crops aren't going to fail. And whereas hunter gatherers, it seems, worked kind of 2-day weeks. As long as you caught enough game or gathered enough berries or whatever, 2 days a week, you could pretty much take the rest of the week off. And so what we see when people switch to farming is that they become shorter, they're less
yeah.
well nourished, they have much less diverse diets, and it generally, and they're having to work much harder. They've got much harder. They've got skeletal damage because they're doing things like kneeling down and working grindstones. So generally, from a health perspective, agriculture was a very bad idea. And so Jared Diamond has described the adoption of agriculture as the greatest mistake in human history. And so one of the questions is, well, why would people switch from this really, quite pleasant sounding lifestyle to being farmers? And one of the reasons is that it is, in theory, more predictable supply of food because you're controlling your supply of food instead of hoping that you'll find some when you're roaming around you'll find some animals to kill or whatever. But I think the other thing that people point out is that you can make beer from these grains, and you see this everywhere, that every part of the world has a particular grain that's used to make beer, and agriculture happens when you see archaeological evidence of people making beer, and then they adopt agriculture.
Yeah.
And so people say, well, they were probably making beer and making bread, or they're making porridges, something in the middle, a kind of porridge that is so you throw grains into a soup to thicken it. And sometimes you might not have had much else to go in that soup except water and grains and maybe some fruit. And then someone would have left that out overnight, and natural yeast would have got into it, and then someday, the next day, someone might have tried it and said, oh, this is quite nice because it's fermented. And then people started trying to figure out how to make that happen deliberately. And once you start to do that, the idea is that drinking alcoholic drinks takes on religious connotations. And again, what we see in all of the earlier civilizations is not just beer drinking, but beer being part of religious rituals. And then you have this idea that one of the things that you get if you settle down is you get reliable access to beer. And I think it was probably not a sort of deliberate decision to become farmers, but what happens is if you spend more of your time settled in an area where there are natural stands of barley in particular, so that you can harvest it and make beer, and then you start replanting some of them to make sure that there's going to be more of it, you spend more of your time there. The other thing that happens is that you can support a larger population if you've got the ability to store food against future shortages, which you can do if you're farming grain and if you're in the same place all year round. If you're a hunter-gatherer, you can't take your supplies of food everywhere with you, and so you start to get things like communal storehouses or granaries where things are stored, and this allows you to support a larger population. And then at some point, without noticing it, you've gone over the threshold where you can no longer live off the land where you are with the size of group that you have just through foraging, because there isn't enough food there. So you basically deplete the local area, and so I think that's what at that point people realized that they couldn't go back, but at least they got to drink beer. So and then you get the earlier civilizations in the Fertile Crescent, in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and everyone is drinking beer, and the pictograms of people, they're drinking beer through straws in Mesopotamia, out of these big jars. The earliest writing, these tiny little clay tablets, you don't get words, you get symbols, and the symbols relate to numbers and to foodstuffs. So and it's because they're recording that the farmers are paying a certain amount of their produce to the government, in effect, the city government, as tax, and that then supports the government's activities, supports the priesthood, and so on. But yes, beer shows up very, very clearly among the first written documents. There is this sign, and it's the sign for a beer jar lying on its side, and it's a currency at that point. And bread and beer are what people are eating and drinking, and they're also, officials are paid a certain ration of bread or beer. And then in Egypt you get this as well. Bread and beer is a greeting. It means sort of health and wealth. And if you look at things like the construction of the pyramids, we can see that the pyramids were built not by people who were enslaved. They were built by people who were actually paid, and they were paid in the form of, they were farmers, and they probably had a rota system. So farmers from different parts of of Egypt were brought in to work on the pyramids, and they were paid in bread and beer. And in fact, the ration tablets survive that show how much they were paid. So they were basically given food and lodging by the government while they built the pyramids, and they were given other things as well. There were some onions in there and some meat and so on, but basically bread and beer is part of it. And I like to think of that. So again, going back to my time machine, now beer is the honest drink of the working man, right? And you imagine Homer Simpson likes beer, or you go to I think you go to a pub in central London, and there'll be people who've just come off a building site because they're constantly rebuilding everything in central London, and they'll be drinking beer, and this is what the people building the pyramids would have been doing too, and so this is one of those sort of commonalities I think that runs all the way throughout history, or throughout 5,000 years.
Yeah. No, it's to me that whole beer theory makes complete sense for the reasons you said. I mean, it just like at a time when there was maybe what 50, 100 million people on the whole planet, there must have been loads of food to capture. So
Right. But if you stop, if you settle down in a particular place,
yeah,
then you're going to kind of deplete. Yeah, so you have to switch to agriculture. So yeah,
exactly.
you get a less varied diet, but you do get beer,
Yeah,
and that's a good thing. And then I mean, there are some interesting characteristics about beer. I mean, you can make it without pottery, but then you can make it with pottery. You can't really store it for very long, so yes, you might as well drink it while you've got it. And so, which is very different from wine, where you have to basically ferment it for much longer, and you can only do that with pottery, and then you can store it as well. And so I think that gives you this distinction between the kind of moderate drinking culture of wine and the sort of binge drinking culture of beer. And I think that's sort of implicit in the way that they're made, particularly with beer before pottery. You basically had to drink it all now. There was no way of storing it. So and then there were ways of storing it later on, but I think that sort of again, I think we see echoes of that now. And then there are other aspects of beer history that I think go back a surprisingly long way. So raising glasses in a toast, and I've got an empty glass here, but that's sort of invoking the supernatural power of alcohol. So it's saying thanks for the alcohol, God, or whatever, or I'm here as a prayer. And then when we bring glasses together, that is symbolically reuniting the separate, because initially people drank beer from the same big pot using straws, but when you started to be able to pour it out, you're symbolically reuniting them to say, look, we are drinking from the same vessel, and I trust you that it's not poison. So that again, I think, is very, very ancient, and we kind of do that without thinking about it today. So that's part of it too. The other thing I should say is that this ancient beer was very different from modern beer. It wouldn't have had hops in it. Hops are a very recent addition to beer, a medieval addition, and in fact, the word beer in English refers to beer with hops in it, and ale was the older kind of drink that didn't have hops in it. So that was the distinction between beer and ale in the kind of early medieval period. Now we have the distinction in ale and lager, and whether things are top fermented or bottom fermented, which is a different thing altogether. But have you ever had a beer without hops in it?
yeah. I've had a
Which
couple.
one have you had? Have you had the King Canute one? That's the one I've had, which is pretty
No, I've
horrible.
had some from Lithuania actually.
Oh
There's
right,
a
okay.
brewery
And
up
what do
there.
they use? What do they use instead of hops to kind of
I
balance the sweetness of the malt?
think it was wormwood.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever had a juniper? I've had a juniper one called King Canute, which was made in England, and so it was using the bitterness of the juniper, and that seems to have been quite a common trick as well. Actually, it gave me an upset tummy. I didn't like it at all. But what's very interesting about those hopless beers, which is what beer would have been like for most of the last 5,000 years, is that you can see that they're much closer to wine, and in fact, you can see that there's a continuation and there's a continuum between beer and wine. Early beers would quite often have had fruit put into them, so there was more sugar for the alcohol to ferment. Sorry, for the yeast to ferment into alcohol. So a way you made stronger beers in the past was by lobbing in some fruit, and so that of course you're getting. If you put in a lot of fruit, then you're starting to make a wine.
Yeah,
And so this idea that beer and wine were not as distinct drinks as they are now, I think is necessary to understand some of the ways that people thought about them in history. That wine was basically posh beer,
right.
is how people thought about it. And there's this interesting record from the Mesopotamian period where wine is referred to as that excellent beer of the mountains. And this is because wine is first cultivated in basically the Zagros Mountains, so modern day sort of Georgia, Iran, that part of the world. And what's happening is that the wine is being brought down from the mountains in boats to Mesopotamia, and the boats can't go back up again because they've come down downstream,
Right,
and so the boats. So this makes wine very expensive to bring down, um, and so only the wealthiest people in Mesopotamia can afford to drink it. And so you get this. I write in the book about I think he's a Babylonian, or is it? No, it's an Assyrian king. So this is in the later period of that whole group of cultures. But he serves this great banquet, and he serves everybody at the banquet gets wine, and that's a really big deal, because previously wine was just like only the elite got it. And you see this in Egypt as well, that wine is the drink for the pharaohs and the ruling class, and everyone else drinks beer. And
right.
so this idea that wine is the sort of fancier, more expensive drink is very, very ancient. And then one of the things that the Greeks and the Romans do is that they increase wine production enormously, and they then say, look, we are such a wealthy culture that everyone drinks wine. Even the slaves have wine. I mean, it's really horrible wine. But they then become very snooty about beer drinking cultures, and places like, oh well, Egypt, they drink that horrible beer stuff, this kind of thing. So that again, we don't recognize the sort of echoes of that we have today. But this idea that beer is the sort of ordinary drink, and then
Yeah,
wine is the fancy drink, and then the connoisseurship, and the idea that within wine itself there are levels of wine. Again, that's very much, the Romans are very much into that. And as I say, you've got this sort of Posca, which is pretty much was it Laura? You've got Laura and Posca, the ones at the bottom. So in the Bible, when Jesus is on the cross and the centurion offers him, it's often translated into English as a sponge dipped in vinegar. This is actually the wine that the centurion has been given as his ration. So it's sort of vinegar like. It was quite sour, but the soldiers, the Roman soldiers, were given a liter of wine a day as part of their ration. That's actually what he was giving Jesus. That's what's happening there. But then at the other end of the scale, you've got like the fanciest wines that the emperor drinks. Falernian was the fanciest wine of all for the Romans. But the idea was that there were all of these gradations in between, and that so again, this idea that when the boss comes around to dinner, you get a slightly fancier bottle of wine because you've got to match the
yeah.
status of the guest with the wine. Very much a Roman idea. And my favourite story from that period about this is a Roman who's on the run. It's during one of the many Roman civil wars, and he's on the run, and he takes refuge in the house of one of his followers and hides under the stairs. And the man whose house he's hiding in says, well, we need to get some fancy wine in, because we've got Mr.
Right.
Fancy pants hiding in the house. So he sends his servant down the road to the wine shop to get some wine, and the wine shop are like, "Whoa, you're buying some quite fancy wine today. What's going on?" And the servant goes, "Yeah, well, don't let on, but we've got Mr. Fancy Pants hiding under the stairs," which of course leads to his his discovery and subsequent murder. But this is the thing: you couldn't possibly serve crappy wine if you had somebody staying in your house, and so so this is again a very, very old idea, and one that we still have today. So I really enjoy sort of tracing the origins of these sort of modern drinking customs, back
Yeah.
to their ancient roots.
Yeah, and I mean that still exists in terms of like Northern Europe and Southern Europe. I always thought
Yeah.
wine thing was just purely where you could grow it, but it's not. It's
Yeah,
the
it's partly that as well. I mean, so I mean, we know that wine was cultivated in England in the Roman period, and of course now we have this fantastic, renaissance of wine growing, and English wine is, even some of the reds are quite good now. Shockingly, it turns out Essex is the best place to grow grapes in England. Who'd have thought? But no, I'm a big fan of the sort of of the new English wine scene. But yes, by and large, I mean, certainly Scandinavia, it's difficult to grow grapes up there, and so yes, you tended to get this northern beer drinking culture. This is after the Romans and the Greeks have introduced viticulture to the whole of southern Europe. You get wine in the south and beer in the north, and then you get the kind of binge drinking, drink to excess, drink for the sake of it, beer drinking in the north. And as I say, this is, I think, very much because you make beer and then you might as well drink it. Whereas wine, you can store it for long periods, and so you get the sort of more drinking with food, drinking in a sort of with more connoisseurship, not just drinking wine on its own, drinking in moderation sort of style of drinking in southern Europe. And I think that cliche is less true than it was, and I think in Britain, has wine overtaken beer now? I think it might have done, but and then of course there's a demographic change happening, which is that younger people are drinking much less than our generation are. But no, broadly, I think there is a lot of truth in that division, and again, it's something that we sort of think about. We imagine today that that
Yeah.
the Northern Europeans tend to be into beer.
And even further than that, I mean, there's what, the vodka belt from kind of around the Baltics to
Oh yeah,
Russia.
no, exactly. Well,
Is
because then you can make even stronger. Yeah, I mean, there's a limit to how strong you can make beer. So then, if you want something stronger than that, I mean, even if you just want something as strong as wine, yes, you're looking at distillation as your way of increasing the ABV. So yeah, absolutely.
so do you think, I mean, obviously you can't split it out definitely, but like the difference between, say, Italian, Greek culture and that is driven an awful lot by the drink, or the drink was driven by the culture?
Well, I think it's the. I'm not saying the whole of Italian culture is down to this, but I just think if you look at the way that if you look at drinking culture in Southern Europe, um, then it's much more normal for children to be given wine at the table, often cut with water, which again was what the Greeks and Romans did. They thought that the adding of water to wine was making the wine safe, and that only the god Dionysus could drink undiluted wine, and it was seen as a very very sort of uh, uncultured thing to do, to drink neat wine. So you always diluted it, maybe 50-50, maybe actually 2 parts water to 1 part wine. And there are people who drink wine like that. Certainly as children, that's how you're introduced to it. So it's much more of a cultural thing, and it's much part of the sort of general uh, you know veneration of food culture that you do see in Southern Europe. I'm not saying the whole of the rest of the culture stems from that, but in Britain, I think we've moved towards more of a Mediterranean style
Yeah,
attitude to drinking. I think,
yeah,
but yeah, you don't you yeah, beer drinking culture is a very very different. It has the connotations of, well, today it has connotations of things like go to a football match or whatever. But I think it's always been a common activity, principally a common activity among men, and a sort of peer group bonding thing. And yes, you can do that with wine, and you get fancy versions of this like the Greek symposium, where you all sit around and drink wine and come up with philosophical witticisms. And the idea was to be just drunk enough. It was to
yeah,
be to have the wine sort of free your tongue. So what is it? One of the philosophers says, "Quick, give me a beaker of wine, so that I may free my tongue and say something witty." But you don't want to be too drunk. And it was also the idea that you saw someone's true character when you drank wine with them, because they sort of they had to open themselves up and reveal who they truly were. So if you were going to, and you get this today, if you classically Japanese culture, you have to go, and if you're doing business in
yeah,
Japan, you all have to go and drink Japanese whiskey, which is very good. And so that sort of thing is, again, that's a very very old idea.
yeah, yeah. No, I was struck by that in your description of the Greeks, and I think the Romans were the same, where you said like they couldn't get too drunk, and there was someone whose job was to
Yeah,
make sure
exactly.
they
To make
got.
sure everyone's sort of just drunk enough. I find this. So I play the drums, and I play the drums much better when I've had about 2 units of alcohol. So a pint of Guinness is great, and or a couple of glasses of wine, and it just makes me less uptight,
Yeah,
and I think it does. It makes me. Less risk averse, so I am more likely to try something slightly daring or something new, which may or may not work. But there's a happy level of. I mean, if you drink too much, then it just will
yeah,
be terrible. But just having that slightly floaty feeling, the 1 pint feeling is, I think, very useful for for me playing the drums. That
yeah,
probably just says a lot about how I'm too uptight as a drummer.
yeah. No, I've spoken to Edward Slingerland. He wrote a book about that some time back, and it was all about how the alcohol kind of switches off the frontal cortex, and
Yeah,
so
so the inhibitions, exactly, which is why you do not want to be driving a car, because you do want to be risk averse. But if you're doing something creative, where taking risks is part of the can mean you
yeah,
get better results, then yes, that's exactly what you want.
yeah. So I mean, I don't know. I've held you now. I know you, like I said, I know you're probably very busy, but could we just touch on this idea before we go? The beer, like you said, beer had to come first, because there is no way to make wine until the beer was there. So the beer is the
Well, it's pottery that you
foundation.
need. So you can't make wine without pottery. And the way beer probably emerged, as I say, was that people were making these sorts of porridges in probably the stomach of an animal. So you can heat that up over a fire. So you make a kind of stew. And you put in whatever you can find, so that would include grains. And on a bad day, all you might be able to find, apart from your meat, would be grains. So you'd make this kind of kind of stew, and you would heat up stones in the fire, or you could heat this directly over a fire. It's a bit like how you can boil water in a paper cup over a flame, and the you think that the paper's going to catch fire, but it doesn't, because the water is carrying away the heat. And it's exactly the same principle. You can actually heat water up over a fire in basically the innards of an animal. So I think that's how beer probably emerged, and then people looked for other ways to make it. And by the time you get to Mesopotamia and Egypt, you have quite what looks to us like quite industrial. You get quite large breweries, and they're making really quite large quantities, and they're making multiple different kinds of beer of different strengths for different purposes. So you've got the sort of small beer for everyday drinking for the children, and then you have sort of stronger beers. And in fact, you get in Egyptian sources there are references to multiple kinds of beer, which seem to have been used in different ways. Some had religious uses, some were stronger, some were used for celebrations and that kind of thing. With wine, the way I think wine production began is that, and you see this if you bury a big jar under the ground, it's an early form of refrigeration, and so people would have because it's like the reason we saw wine in cellars is underground. The temperature doesn't change very much, even when the weather outside is changing quite a lot, and so people would have been putting things to store into these vessels. And if you put grapes into a big vessel, then under the mass of the other grapes, you'll get some juice at the bottom, and it will ferment. And someone must have tried it and thought, oh, this is rather good, let's have some more of that. In fact, let's squash the grapes, and then we'll keep it in the jar for 6 months and see what happens. And then they start to refine the winemaking process from that. And we can see the archaeological evidence of this from the Zagros Mountains. There are these pots, and it's Pat McGovern, and you should definitely have him on if you haven't had him on. He's the Indiana Jones of wine. Actually, is he still alive? I hope he is. Better check. But he's written some great books on this, and found many of the earliest examples. And so, yes, as far as we can see, I mean, there are cases of pottery. In theory, I think there are some examples for Japan that are about 10,000 BC. But basically, we don't see winemaking. We see winemaking. We don't see beer. We see beer. We don't see winemaking until about the 6th millennium BC, and then you always see it with pottery. And that's because we wouldn't see any evidence of it. But I just don't see how you could ferment anything for 6 months unless you've got pottery. So that's a different process. But then once you've got pottery, you can use it for both, and that's what we see later on.
Yeah, but pottery didn't arrive until there was a civilization beforehand, so that needed the beer.
Well, I suppose so. I mean, it depends what you mean. Civilization is technically living in cities, and so there were people making pottery before they were living in cities. But once you get to a city scale, when you've got a city state like you get in Mesopotamia, you get places like Uruk and and essentially you've got a sort of big walled city, and then you've got fields around the outside of it, and that's where the cultivation happens, and then you bring all the produce into the city, and then it's kind of, I mean, this is on a big flat plain in what's now Iraq, and you could often see one city from the next city, but you never knew if an army was going to come over the horizon, so you had to be able to retreat into your city, and then you've got all your fields on the outside, and so yes, that's how that works. And the evidence we have from those cities is you start to get regions of the city where you get specific specialism in different things, whether it's woodworking or textiles or brewing, and then you also have this system where the farmers are paying a fraction of their produce to the state, which then uses that to pay the state's wages and to administer it, and that's the basis of the tax. And this is justified on religious grounds, that if you don't give the priesthood a certain amount of your wheat or barley every year, they won't be able to do the special rituals that ensure that the crops will continue to appear, or the rains won't fail, and of course everyone has to go along with this, right? I mean, no one wants to not do the rituals in case the rituals are in fact making it rain. And you get these strikingly similar agricultural religions everywhere. You get them in South America, you get them in the Middle East, you get them in East Asia, and that's the sort of origin of cities, origin of religion, origin of lots of things.
Yeah, but the other thing that's really struck me was that had never occurred to me before is I was aware of Rome and bringing loads of grains and the rations into Rome because of such a big city, but I never realized that an awful lot of that was driven by the fact that they had replaced all their own grains with wine.
Right. So well, particularly when Egypt was taken over by Rome, when it became a Roman province, and Egypt was then able to supply an enormous amount of grain to Rome, and these massive grain ships would go over to Rome, over to Italy, and they had it was quite often, bread and circuses, as we talk about, and bread and circuses was the whole point was that was, this is all that the people expect the emperor to provide: bread and circuses. They want entertainment and they want food on the table. But it was true, and it was a kind of classic, in the same way that politicians now during an election campaign say, yes, we're going to increase the what pensioners get, or they basically do handouts to different groups. Politicians would say, I'll give everyone free bread, and so they did, and then you had to, I'll do free bread and I'll do some games, and so there was this bread ration, and initially only some people qualified for it, but gradually it gets more and more generous, and in order to provide that, you had to bring in a huge amount of grain. And at the same time, the Romans like to think of themselves as a very unpretentious people, unlike those pretentious philosophical Greeks who are always just like sitting around arguing about philosophy. Yeah, the Romans thought of themselves much more as a sort of as a military people, but as primarily actually as farmers. And the Roman ideal was that you would have a great illustrious career in the military or in politics or both, and they were kind of the same. And then you would retire to your farm, and you would go back to the roots of the Roman people, which is they were just simple farmers. And of course, this is nonsense. This is like when film directors buy vineyards now, they don't actually do any of the farming, but they just like the idea. They want other people to do it for them, but they like the idea that that's a sort of return to a simple way of life. And again, that was something the Romans did. They were very big on, and so having their own vineyards, being able to make their own wine, was a high status thing to do, just like it is today. And that meant that the amount of grain being produced in the Italian peninsula was possibly not as high as it could have been, and they were then reliant on imports from elsewhere, particularly in Rome, because when Rome was the biggest city in the world at the time, a population of about 1 million in the first century AD, it would seem. And so it's just logistically how you're going to get enough food to those people. You're going to have to have a really quite serious system of shipping it in from wherever you can get it elsewhere in the empire.
Yeah. So again, it's hard to say what the chicken and egg in this, but like maybe it was their love of wine that drove them to take over everywhere else in the first place.
Well, actually, I think the way it works is the other way around, which is that the wine and winemaking culture is spread around the Mediterranean by the Phoenicians and then the Greeks, and the Greeks establish essentially Greek colonies all over the Western Mediterranean, and they bring with them the culture of drinking wine and the knowledge of cultivating wines. If you look at the wine industry in the south of France or in Spain, it's the Greeks who introduce the vine, and so they are spreading their cultural values. And one of the things that goes along with that might make you want to move into one of these towns that sprung up is the fact that they've got wine and they know about wine and wine culture. And so yes, that's very much something that came with. There's a whole cultural bundle, and another thing that comes with it is alphabetic writing. So the Phoenician alphabet is they have the first true alphabet, and then you have the Greek and the Roman alphabets after that as well. And so again, this bundle of stuff seems to be traded along, sent along the trade routes, and so yeah, wine is part of that.
All right. Well, I'm going to stick with the idea that beer is at the root of it all, and without beer,
yes, exactly. And if you want more evidence for like beer is the basis of civilization, then yes, it's all in my book.
Yeah. And Tom, listen, I know it's coming up later. I've held you probably have a lot of things to get to for the day. So this was just like the book. It was like the book. It's just a flood of information in a very entertaining way. So hopefully.
Well, thank you. And yeah, we didn't even get onto all of those other drinks, but yeah, this is very much the tone of voice of the book. It's just sort of guys sitting around and talking about drink, and so that's what we've done today.
Yeah, because there's tons of stuff there. Like there is so much in it. Like I said, that that this whole switch from alcoholic to non-alcoholic.
Yeah, no, exactly.
The influence of it all. It is just, but it's all there in the book. And
now I'm very surprised you haven't asked me what my favorite beer is. So.
Well, okay.
We haven't actually talked about actual beers, so. No.
Well, because I was going to get onto, if we had time, the way that like this whole thing about fanciness around wines has started coming into beer as well.
Connoisseurship of beer, yeah, I think that's true, yeah, and I think the kind of the arms race towards higher IBUs with the like double hopped IPAs. That's all a bit ridiculous.
Yeah.
I think the problem with my favorite beer for a long time, my answer has been the same, which has been Liberty Ale from the Anchor Brewery in San Francisco. And in fact, when I started writing this book, the first stop I made was to see Fritz Maytag, because one of the things he had done is he had reconstructed the ancient Sumerian beer, the Mesopotamia beer, and he'd actually got someone to go and harvest wild barley for him, and he had made this kind of bread, which is how they used to store it so that they could make beer quickly. So they would malt it, and then they would make it into this bread, and then they could add that to water, and then they could, that was how they sort of stored the beer making ingredients. And he gave me some of that bread, which still had a lot of chaff in it, and this is why they drank with straws, because there's a lot of chaff floating on the top. Anyway, I went to see him in San Francisco at his brewery, and I think I got there at like 10 o'clock in the morning, and he was like, "So what do you want to drink?" And I was like, "Whoa, wait a minute, it's only 10 o'clock in the morning." And I've regretted ever since not having a Liberty Ale on tap, because draft Liberty Ale, you used to be able to get it in SFO at the airport. Anyway, unfortunately, Fritz died, and the Anchor Steam and that whole brewery is gone now.
Yeah.
But that was sort of one of the origins of the West Coast microbrewery movement, wasn't it? So anyway, so for a long time that was my favorite beer, but unfortunately it's not there anymore. I suppose it's quite close to. I think of it as quite close to Gamma Ray from the Beavertown Brewery, but. Anyway, so sadly that's so. I like their neck oil as well, and they did a fantastic collaboration called Skull Water, which I very much enjoyed.
Right.
Anyway, so I suppose that was my usual answer, but unfortunately that beer has ascended to the heavens and is no longer available.
So what is it now?
Well, it's whatever's in front of me, I suppose. No, I'm quite into the juicy hazy IPA style at the moment, and there are various versions of that I quite like. I'm not a fan of kind of English warm beer, bitter, and as I say, I like the APA style, not the IPA style. So the kind of hoppy but not too hoppy, and all the rest of it. So yeah, that's the kind of sweet spot for me, and I'm just sort of constantly trying new beers in that area. But I don't think I have a single answer.
Well, there is a suggestion for you. Up towards Lithuania and the Baltics, there, some of them, they still have real kind of farmhouse brewing techniques and that. And there's one that you mentioned there with the bread, where they kind of bake bread and they use it. So there's at least one brewery up there still doing something like that. They make the mash and they bake it, and then they put that in to make the beer. So
right. Oh, brilliant. Well, I think that does seem to be how beer was made in the past, and in fact we see this in Egyptian records as well. They talk about the beer that is used to make bread, and it seems that it was also used as a sort of ration, so you could store this stuff, and you could give it to soldiers on campaign if you had to, so you could eat it, or you could make beer out of it. And so it was a kind of intermediate story. I can't remember the name of it, but there is a word that we know that means that. The other beer that I like, but I can only get in one part of the world, is Mac and Jack from Washington State, and I think it's actually an imitation of an African style of beer. And I've had some sort of African traditional craft beers made from millet, which are more like yogurt than beer. They're kind of vaguely beer, and I drank some of those when I was researching the book. I was in South Africa and got to try some of them. But anyway, that's it. But Mac and Jack is not available anywhere else because it's a living beer, and you can't. I don't think they even bottle it. So whenever I'm in Washington State, I have to go and have some of that.
I haven't been in Washington State for.
Well, look out for that one then.
We'll look for that.
Cool.
All right. Listen, Tom. Like I said, it's been brilliant chat. I know you have to. You've been here for an hour, so I better let you go.
Okay. Well, it's great talking to you. Thank you very much, and happy drinking beer. Cheers.
Okay, and I'll hopefully we'll find. I'm going to check out that Mac and Jack when I get a chance. So
do. Okay, thanks a lot. Great
to
talk to you.
Thanks a million.
Bye.
Bye.